Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of The Inclusive Consumer. This podcast has been a long time in the making, about a year and a half. It went from conversations and the idea to finally the strategic planning and the execution. I'm so excited to share the Inclusive Consumer podcast with you all. This podcast is going to really become your favorite podcast, covering topics at the forefront of every modern marketer's mind: strategy, social media, content, growth, influencer partnerships, demographic, psychographic, and of course, target marketing. Whether you are a marketing leader or a marketing enthusiast, this podcast is for you. I'm Deborah Walton, your podcast host. I'm the founder and managing partner of Inclusion by Design Co., a consulting firm specializing in inclusive strategy, inclusive marketing, and inclusive product consulting to help organizations increase their revenue and brand reach. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an African American woman with brown skin, dark brown braids, dark brown eyes, and I'm wearing a black blouse and a pearl necklace in front of a branded background for the Inclusive Consumer Podcast. It is a pink background with the Inclusive Consumer Podcast logo in the top corner. For those of you unfamiliar with that practice, that is a visual description. I want to ensure that listeners from the blind and low vision communities have an inclusive experience with the podcast, especially when tuning in to enjoy the show on YouTube. As we get started, I want to take a moment and share a land acknowledgement statement. I acknowledge that I am on the ancestral lands of the Cherokee and Shawnee people. I acknowledge these tribes and nations as the rightful and traditional protectors and caretakers of these lands. I encourage you to learn more about the lands you are on and to reflect on your own place in this work. Now, this podcast is titled The Inclusive Consumer, and you may be wondering, who is the inclusive consumer? This is a part of our podcast topic today. Today's consumers do not buy the first product or service they come across. The modern consumer is inclusive. They care about their identity and culture and the identities and cultures of others. And they expect to see companies not only respecting, but also celebrating the dynamic humanity that is reflected in the modern world. Today's modern consumer is the inclusive consumer. Now, on to this episode. Our topic is inclusive marketing. What is it and why is it important? And a more detailed review of who the inclusive consumer is in the United States. So let's get this marketing party started. As we jump into our podcast topic for today, really want to share some data to really lay the foundation for this episode. 75% of consumers want the companies that they purchase from to demonstrate a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And only 24% of consumers say it's common for brands to demonstrate this commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. That's research from Big Village. The buying power of racial and ethnic underrepresented consumers in the US is exploding. It was 4.2 trillion in the year of 2020 and is projected to reach 7 trillion by 2025. And that is from Insider Intelligence. People with disabilities spend $500 billion annually. That's from UsableNet. Let's cover two more data points. Business Insider estimated that Gen Z has around $360 billion, billion with a B, in disposable income. And women overall make up more than half of the US population and control or influence 85% of consumer spending. That's according to My Code Media. Now, why am I sharing this data? This data is really important as we ground the foundation for this conversation around inclusive marketing and who the inclusive consumer is. All of these data points talk about the opportunity, the buying power for historically excluded and marginalized groups. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about why this data is important and how much money your brand is potentially leaving on the table because you are not being inclusive in your marketing strategies. So first, what is inclusive marketing? Let's talk about what it's not. Inclusive marketing is not translating one social media post into Spanish as a caption. Inclusive marketing is not having one person with disabilities in a TV commercial within a particular campaign that you have for an advertisement. Inclusive marketing is not updating your website with stock pictures of people of color. Let's talk about what inclusive marketing is. Inclusive marketing is marketing that celebrates diversity in all forms. Diversity is the representation of different social, cultural, and identity demographic factors. So when you think about age, you think about race, you think about ethnicity, gender, physical and mental ability status, body shape, body size, religious affiliation, and so many others. Inclusive marketing recognizes that each person is dynamic and lives with multiple diversity dimensions. And we all live within communities with dynamic diversity. So, inclusive marketing is really marketing that not only honors and respects diversity, but it celebrates it. And there is a difference. The key to inclusive marketing is not just identifying diversity, but it's really celebrating it, right? So it's not just only representation or the acknowledgement, it's the celebration, it's the opportunity to really be very authentic and honor and embrace and elevate the different dimensions of diversity. It's not something off to the side, it's not one campaign, it's not one social media post. It is a way to approach your marketing. Inclusive marketing authentically connects with consumers because it highlights the humanity of people through leveraging targeted marketing strategies and campaigns. So now we've covered what inclusive marketing is. Inclusive marketing, again, just to make sure we have the definition, is marketing that celebrates diversity. Celebration. That's the key element here. You're celebrating diversity in all forms in your marketing. So, why is it important? Why are we having this conversation? Why did I set aside the time, invest the time to create this podcast talking about inclusive marketing? Because it is very important. And it's important because it will increase revenue, it will increase brand loyalty. It's a competitive advantage to help your brand stand out from your competitors, and it honors the humanity of people. Now, I know there's a lot of different positions and points of view on inclusion, diversity, equity, and sometimes the case can be made that it's the right thing to do. We're talking about moral principles. Well, on this podcast, marketing is a expense that businesses have to pay for in order to be successful. And so we're talking about inclusive marketing from the perspective not only of morality, but really it's a strategic advantage. It's something that's going to impact and affect your bottom line. Exclusionary marketing practices lead to business loss. Consumers today have a choice, and they intentionally spend their discretionary income with brands that respect, honor, and celebrate who they are and who their loved ones are. Now, I want to make take a moment to really talk in detail more about the loved ones part, because just if someone identifies within a particular community, that doesn't mean that that's the only community that they care about. They also care about those around them, their family members, their best friend, their friends and colleagues and professional partners. People care about who is in their life. And so when you think about inclusive marketing and the really great opportunity to use it as a strategic advantage for your brand, you're not only going to honor one or two different underrepresented groups, you're really going to be inclusive, which means you're celebrating the dynamic diversity that exists. And so, really thinking about how one campaign, one strategy, one message can be inclusive goes beyond just targeting one group. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about the inclusive consumer, the lovely name of this podcast. The inclusive consumer, who is that? It's any consumer who cares about their identity and culture and the identities and cultures of others. For example, I am an inclusive consumer, and I'll tell you, I'm not alone. An inclusive consumer is someone who really wants their identity and culture, the identity and culture of others, to be respected, honored, and celebrated. And it should be at the forefront of marketing strategies, messaging, campaigns, advertising, and product design. So let's talk through an example. One of my mentors, who is a Gen X gay male, doesn't just care about marketing to empower the LGBTQIA plus and Generation X communities. He wants to see positive celebrations of the Indigenous community and also women being respected and not objectified. This is a really powerful example of how inclusive marketing is not just about one underrepresented group. I've found that a lot of brands really want to have just one particular audience or one particular message to everyone, and that just doesn't work. My philosophy in marketing is that mass marketing is not going to be effective. If you're marketing to everyone, you are essentially marketing to no one. Let's talk through another example. My neighbor. My neighbor is a disabled Latina veteran, and she doesn't just care about marketing to empower the disability community or advertisements that focus on Latino culture or products that make life easier for veterans. She also cares about Asian and other underrepresented groups being reflected respectfully and celebrated in both the marketing and the product experience with brands. This is important. Again, most people who are, and all people who are inclusive consumers, are really looking to see the celebration of diversity, not just within their own particular identity, but of others, because that shows that you're honoring humanity. McKinsey and Company and also Bain and Company have both done research on the inclusive consumer. Their findings support the growing importance of the inclusive consumer. So let's talk about some research. Bain and Company did a grocery retail study and found that a lack of inclusion encouraged significant numbers of shoppers to switch retailers from one store to another. McKinsey and Company found that the American consumer is undeniably becoming more inclusive. Responding to an October 2021 survey, 2 out of 3 Americans shared their social values now shape their shopping choices, and 45%, likely representing well over 100 million shoppers, believe retailers should actively support Black-owned businesses and brands. This 45% represents part of the inclusive consumer segment. I think a lot about these different social movements like Stop Asian Hate and Black Lives Matter. And these are really important movements that honestly, people who are inclusive consumers care about, whether or not they identify as members of that specific community. So, what can you do? How can you use this information? What you want to do as a marketing leader is you want to be able to leverage inclusive marketing as a competitive advantage. Most brands are not implementing inclusive marketing, and it's really a missed opportunity. You're leaving lots of money for consumers to spend with other brands who are getting it right. We all know that people buy from brands that they know, like, and trust. And when there's alignment in those values and a brand is able to authentically resonate and be relevant, then a consumer is going to come, purchase, have a delightful experience and opportunity to come back and purchase again. You're increasing that brand loyalty. We also know that word of mouth marketing is extremely powerful. And so when a consumer is engaging with the brand and they're happy, they're having a positive experience, they enjoy the product or service, they're going to then tell others. And when you are inclusive in your marketing, other people that are shared and learn information from a particular consumer will see inclusive marketing and understand and notice that their humanity is being celebrated, and they're more likely to then become more brand advocates and more consumers that help to support and grow revenue for your bottom line. The last thing I want to share is that in some of the upcoming podcast episodes this season, you're going to hear some really interesting perspectives. And so when we think about underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, what we often don't think about is the number of the population dynamics that are changing because of not only foreign citizens, but also immigrants. And so there is a really large opportunity for brands to start learning about inclusive marketing, learning about who the inclusive consumer is, and really being able to leverage that over time because the population dynamics in the United States are changing. What we currently have here in 2024 is not what things are going to look like 10 or 15 years from now. The brands that are starting to get it right and are continuing to get it right in the space of inclusive marketing will be laying the foundation for their future success later. The data is very clear. Population demographics are changing. And pretty soon, I won't be saying the terms underrepresented to represent certain racial and ethnic groups. People of color will then be the majority. So then what I will use is the term historically marginalized or historically excluded, because that's just a fact and that's the proper label for this group. And of course, I happen to be in the group, as you can see, or if you have looked at the picture of this podcast, you can see that I identify and I am a woman of color. So, as a marketing leader, as a marketing enthusiast, my challenge and my encouragement to you is to make data-driven decisions about how you can grow your brand using inclusive marketing. Inclusive marketing is a growth strategy, and I don't know one brand that's currently operating that doesn't want to grow. Grow to increase more revenue, grow to increase brand loyalty, grow to increase the bottom line. I don't know one brand in this market, in this world, that doesn't want to grow. So inclusive marketing is your opportunity and your chance to really increase your bottom line and also take your brand to the next level. Now, if you have questions, you want to learn more about inclusive marketing as a growth strategy for your brand, how you can effectively connect with inclusive consumers, reach out to us. Go to inclusionbydesignco.com and schedule a free strategy session. If you'd like, you can get a complimentary website homepage audit or a social media profile audit. Inclusive marketing can be scary to get started and it's difficult to get it right. You don't have to do it alone. My team at Inclusion by Design Co. is ready to help you win the inclusive consumer with the right inclusive marketing strategy. More often than not, in my conversations with business leaders and marketing executives, the reason why inclusive marketing is not being leveraged is because of fear. They don't want to say the wrong thing, they don't know how to do it, and they're really just unsure of this space. And so having a strategic thought partner will really help you to leverage the power of inclusive marketing to win the inclusive consumer. If you liked this episode of The Inclusive Consumer, please subscribe, write us a positive review, and tell a friend. And with that, we will conclude this podcast episode and chat with you in the next one. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this first season of The Inclusive Consumer.